We're counting down 30 stagecoach stop meals travelers ate before crossing outlaw country. Long before railroads stitched the West together, a journey across the frontier meant days rattling inside a Concord coach, and the only thing between a passenger and an empty stomach was a lonely station standing at the edge of nowhere. From greasy bacon fried at dawn to coffee thick enough to float a horseshoe, these were the meals that fueled travelers before they braved stretches of country where road agents waited and the law had never reached. Expect strange frontier dishes, wild game most Americans have never tasted, and food so rough that diaries still complain about it a century later. Which station meal tops our list? Let's begin the countdown with number 30. Number 30, fried cornmeal mush greeted travelers at dawn when nothing else was left in the station larder. The keeper's wife boiled coarse cornmeal in salted water the night before, poured the thick paste into a greased pan, and let it set solid overnight in the cold. Come morning, she sliced it into slabs and fried them in bacon grease until the edges turned golden and crisp. A plate cost about 15 cents on the cheaper lines, and it filled a belly for hours of jolting road ahead. One passenger's journal called it plain but honest, the kind of breakfast that asked nothing and gave just enough. On the long, dry stretches west of the settlements, it was often all a hungry stage rider could hope for before the horn sounded and the coach rolled on. Number 29, vinegar pie earned its place where fresh fruit was a distant memory, and the nearest orchard lay 1,000 miles behind. With no lemons and no berries within reach, the station cook stirred cider vinegar into a custard of sugar, flour, and eggs, then baked it in a rough crust until the top browned and cracked. The tang fooled the tongue into believing it tasted citrus, a small miracle conjured from a cupboard holding almost nothing. Travelers' diaries recall the surprise of a sweet dessert appearing at a windswept outpost, the sharp, bright flavor cutting through days of grease and dust. It cost a dime a slice and vanished in minutes. Some called it desperation pie, proof that even at the ends of the earth, a little ingenuity could turn vinegar into comfort. Number 28, dried apple pie carried a taste of home across 2,000 miles of wilderness. Barrels of dried apple rings shipped west by wagon and reconstituted in warm water, swelling back to something close to fresh, sweetened with sugar and a shake of cinnamon. By the late 1850s, dried apples were a fixture in freight orders bound for the overland stations, prized because they kept for months in the heat. The cook rolled out a crust with a bottle for want of a proper pin, filled it, and baked it in a cast-iron oven over coals. Passengers wrote of the joy of a warm slice after weeks of salt pork and hardtack. Dried apple pie was the closest thing to Sunday dinner a traveler would find between the Missouri and the mountains, and it rarely lasted the length of a meal stop. Number 27. Sorghum molasses sweetened nearly everything at a station that could afford it. A thick, dark syrup poured over biscuits, mush, and flapjacks alike. Sugar was costly and scarce on the frontier, so cooks reached for sorghum, boiled down from cane, and shipped west in tins and jugs. A spoonful stirred into weak coffee or drizzled across a hot corn dodger turned a plain meal into a small luxury. Travelers remembered the sticky sweetness clinging to their fingers as the coach lurched back onto the trail. It cost the station little and stretched a long way, a single jug flavoring dozens of meals. In a land where every ounce of sweetness had to be hauled across deserts and mountains, sorghum was the humble treasure of the station cupboard. Number 26. Cove oysters, sealed in tin cans and hauled from the coasts, brought an unlikely taste of the sea to stations baking under the desert sun. The transcontinental canning trade meant a passenger crossing the driest country imaginable could be served oysters stewed in milk, a dish that seemed almost absurd amid the sagebrush. A can cost $1 or more at a remote outpost, and the keeper opened it with ceremony, tipping the pale meat into a pot of warmed milk with a knob of precious butter. The briny steam drew astonished looks from travelers who had not seen the ocean in years. It was an extravagance, a reminder that the tin can was quietly changing what the frontier could eat, carrying the flavor of distant waters to tables where no river ran. Number 25. Canned peaches, known to old-timers as airtights, were the sweetest prize a station could set before a traveler. Shipped in heavy tins that survived the roughest freight wagons, the golden fruit swam in thick syrup that men drank straight from the can when the fruit was gone. By the 1860s, airtights had become legendary across the West, a coveted luxury costing 50 cents to $1 a tin and worth every penny to a passenger sick of salt and grease. The keeper's knife punched the lid, and the smell of sugared peaches filled the room like a memory of summer. In a country of hardtack and jerky, that bright, sweet fruit was joy in a tin, and more than one weary rider counted the miles to the next station that stocked them. Number 24. Jackrabbit stew simmered in station pots wherever the long-eared hares bounded across the flats, which was nearly everywhere on the western plains. The keeper or a hired hand shot them near the corral, skinned and jointed the lean meat, and set it stewing for hours with onions, wild herbs, and whatever roots the garden gave up. Jackrabbit was tough and gamey, so time and low heat were the only way to coax it tender, the pot bubbling while the coach horses were changed outside. Travelers described the strong, wild flavor, not to everyone's liking, but filling and free for the taking. On the leanest routes, jackrabbit was the difference between a hot supper and none, and the crack of a rifle near a station often meant stew before the next coach arrived. Number 23. Sage hen, the plump grouse of the western high country, made one of the finer suppers a lucky traveler might find. The birds fed on wild sage, which lent their dark meat a faint, bitter herbal note that some passengers loved and others could not abide. A station hand with a good gun could bring back several in an hour, and the cook plucked and roasted them over the fire or stewed them in gravy with dumplings floating on top. Travelers crossing the sagebrush plains wrote with pleasure of a hot roasted sage hen after days of dried meat. It was seasonal and unreliable, which made it feel like a small celebration when it appeared, and for a moment the hardship of the road fell away. Number 22. Antelope steak was the sweet reward of the open plains, cut from the pronghorn that grazed in vast herds across the grasslands. Leaner and milder than most game, antelope cooked fast, so the station cook fried thin steaks hard in a screaming hot skillet, salting them heavily to draw out the flavor. A driver or hunter who dropped a pronghorn near the road could feed a whole station for days. Travelers marveled at the delicate taste, some calling it the best meat they had eaten since leaving home. On routes crossing the great buffalo country, antelope steak was proof that the frontier, for all its hardship, could still lay out a meal a city man would envy, hot from the pan and gone in minutes. Number 21. Elk steak anchored the tables of stations set against the mountains, where the great animals came down to the valleys in the cold months. A single elk yielded meat enough to feed passengers for a week, hung in the cool station cellar and cut as needed. The cook fried thick steaks in bacon fat or set haunches roasting slowly through the night, the rich, dark meat filling the room with a smell that turned heads the moment a coach rolled in. Travelers crossing the Rockies wrote of elk as hearty fare, deeply flavored and satisfying after miles of thin, cold trail. In the high passes where winter closed in early, a plate of hot elk was the fuel that carried a traveler on toward the Outlaw haunted canyons ahead. Number 20. Venison graced station tables across nearly every route where deer could be hunted, the most dependable wild meat of the frontier. The keeper or a paid hunter brought in a buck, dressed it, and hung it to age. Then the cook fried, roasted, or stewed the meat, depending on the cut and the hour. Passengers came to expect venison so often that some wrote of tiring of it, longing for plain beef instead. Yet a hot venison steak with gravy and biscuits was a fine supper by any measure, and it cost the station nothing but a hunter's time. It was the quiet backbone of frontier dining, the meat that filled the gap between the last salt pork barrel and the next supply wagon. Number 19, buffalo hump and tongue were the delicacies of the Great Plains, prized above almost any meat the frontier offered. Where the vast herd still roamed, a hunter could bring in the rich, fatty hump meat and the tender tongue, both considered the finest eating on the animal. The station cook roasted the hump slowly until it fell apart and boiled the tongue until it could be sliced cold. Travelers' journals recall buffalo as the great treat of the overland journey, a meat unlike anything eaten back east, deeply flavored and rich with fat. It appeared only where the herds crossed near the road, which made it feel like a gift, and a supper of buffalo humps sent travelers back to the coach content. Number 18, pemmican was the frontier's oldest travel food, a dense cake of dried pounded meat mixed with rendered fat and sometimes dried berries, learned from the tribes who had crossed these lands for centuries. It kept for months without spoiling and packed enormous energy into a small brick, perfect for the stretches between stations where no fresh food could be found. Cooks sometimes crumbled it into hot water for a quick, rough stew, or travelers gnawed it cold on the moving coach. The taste was strong and greasy, and city passengers often wrinkled their noses, but experienced frontier hands swore by its power. On the loneliest legs of the journey, pemmican was the reserve that stood between a traveler and real hunger. Number 17, jerky hung in strips at nearly every station, the simplest way to keep meat from spoiling in a land without ice. Thin ribbons of beef, venison, or buffalo were salted and dried in the sun or over a low smoky fire until hard and dark, then hung from the rafters to be gnawed on the road. Travelers bought handfuls to chew as the coach lurched between meal stops, the tough, salty meat softening slowly against the jaw. It cost only pennies and lasted indefinitely. When the coach rolled through outlaw territory and no station dared serve a leisurely meal, jerky was what passed for supper, chewed in silence as the horses ran hard across the emptiest and most perilous miles of the West. Number 16, hardtack, the flat rock-hard biscuit that had fed armies for generations, was the station's insurance against an empty larder. Made from nothing but flour and water, baked until iron hard, it kept for years and survived any journey, which made it a fixture in overland freight. Travelers soaked it in coffee or stew to soften it enough to bite, for eating it dry risked a broken tooth. Diaries from the trail complained bitterly of hardtack, cursing its jaw-cracking toughness even as they were grateful to have it. When storms delayed the supply wagons or the game grew scarce, hardtack was what stood between a stranded coach and real hunger. It asked much and gave little, but it never spoiled and never ran out. Number 15, corn dodgers were the frontier's everyday bread, rough little cakes of cornmeal, water, and salt fried hard in bacon grease until the crust turned deep gold. Cheap, fast, and filling, they appeared at almost every station meal, stacked hot beside the beans and salt pork. The cook shaped them by hand and dropped them into the spitting fat, and travelers ate them by the fistful, dunking them in gravy or molasses. Denser and heavier than any bread back east, a corn dodger sat in the belly for hours, exactly what a passenger needed for a long, jolting run. They cost the station almost nothing and never failed, the plain, reliable bread of the overland trail, always on the table when a hungry coach pulled in. Number 14, Johnny Cake, close cousin to the corn dodger, was the flatter, griddle-cooked cornbread that fed travelers wherever cornmeal could be had. The cook mixed meal with water or buttermilk, spread it thin, and cooked it on a hot greased griddle until both sides browned. Some believe the name came from journey cake, for it kept well in a saddlebag and traveled without crumbling. Eaten hot with molasses or a smear of grease, it was simple, honest fare that turned up at breakfast and supper alike. Passengers wrote of Johnny Cake as plain but welcome, the reliable bread of the poorer stations where wheat flour was too dear to keep. Rough and unpretentious, it was the taste of making do, and countless travelers were glad enough to have it steaming on their plate. Number 13. Flapjack sizzled on station griddles at first light, the closest thing to a treat a traveler was likely to find at breakfast. The cook stirred flour, salt, and a little sorghum into a batter loosened with water or sour milk, then poured it onto a hot, greased surface and flipped the cakes golden. Stacked high and drowned in molasses, flapjacks were a small comfort before another brutal day on the road. Travelers wrote warmly of a hot stack after a cold night at a way station, the sweetness, a rare pleasure. They cost a dime or so and filled a plate generously. On a frontier of grease and salt, flapjacks with syrup were a soft, bright spot in the grinding routine of overland travel. Number 12. Red-eye gravy poured over biscuits was the breakfast that put a fire in a traveler's belly. The cook fried slices of salty ham or salt pork, then splashed strong black coffee into the hot drippings, scraping up the browned bits into a thin, sharp gravy the color of rust. Ladled over split biscuits, it was salty, bitter, and bracing all at once, the kind of food that woke a man up faster than the coffee itself. Travelers on the southern routes especially wrote of red-eye gravy as a favorite, the coffee and pork drippings marrying into something greater than either alone. On a raw, cold morning at a lonely station, a plate of biscuits swimming in red-eye gravy was exactly the jolt a traveler needed before facing the trail. Number 11. So-belly, the fried slabs of fatty salt pork, was the greasy mainstay that turned up at station after station across the entire West. Cut thick from the barrel and fried until the edges crackled, it was salty enough to make a traveler reach twice for the water dipper, but it kept for months without spoiling, which made it indispensable. The cook fried it hard in the morning and saved the grease for everything else on the stove. Travelers complained endlessly of the endless salt pork, dreaming of fresh beef, yet they ate it because it was always there. On the driest and loneliest routes where no game roamed and no garden grew, so-belly was survival itself. Number 10. Slumgullion was the catch-all stew of the frontier station, a thin, watery brew of whatever the cook could find thrown into one pot. Scraps of meat, a handful of beans, a few potatoes, and a great deal of water simmered together into something that filled a bowl, if not the heart. The name became a joke among travelers, a byword for weak, muddy fare, and one famous overland passenger used it to mock both the stew and the pale coffee served alongside. It cost a few cents and asked no questions about what floated in it. Yet on a cold night far from anywhere, even Slumgullion was warm and wet and welcome, the honest bottom of frontier cooking, made from nearly nothing. Number 9. Son-of-a-gun stew was the cowhand's dish that found its way onto station tables wherever cattle were butchered nearby. Made from the odds and ends most cooks discarded, the heart, liver, sweetbreads, and marrow gut, it simmered for hours into a rich, thick stew that wasted no part of the animal. Frontier cooks guarded their own versions, each swearing theirs was the proper one. Travelers who tried it wrote of a deep, hearty flavor that surprised them, given its humble origins. It cost the station little because it used the cuts no one else wanted. Born of thrift and the refusal to waste, son-of-a-gun stew turned the leavings of the slaughter into a supper that sent a traveler back to the coach, warm and filled. Number 8. Chili con carne blazed onto the tables of the southern stations, where the Butterfield line and its rivals ran through country shaped by Mexican cooking. A fiery stew of beef, simmered with dried chilies, cumin, and garlic, it warmed a traveler to the bones and cleared the dust from the throat. For passengers from back east, the heat came as a shock. some loving it and others gasping for the water dipper. It cost only a few cents a bowl and stretched cheap, tough beef into something bold and memorable. On the long, hot runs through the desert Southwest, where road agents watched the passes, a bowl of chili was the meal that steeled a traveler for the dangerous miles ahead. Number 7. Frijoles, the slow-cooked pinto beans of the Mexican kitchen, simmered in station pots all along the southern trails, cooked for hours with salt pork or lard until soft and creamy, then often fried in fat for a second life. They were cheap, filling, and endlessly reliable. On the routes running through the borderlands, frijoles appeared at nearly every meal, ladled hot beside tortillas and chili. Travelers wrote of the rich, savory beans as a welcome change from the eternal salt pork of the northern lines. A bowl cost mere pennies and sat heavy and satisfying in the belly. Frijoles were the humble foundation of Southwestern station dining, stretching a shilling's worth of beans into a proper supper. Number 6. Tortillas replaced bread entirely on the southern routes. The thin, flat rounds of corn or wheat that the station cook patted out by hand and cooked on a hot griddle. Fresh from the fire, soft and warm, they were used to scoop beans, wrap meat, and mop up chili, doing the work of a fork for travelers who had none. Passengers from the east, accustomed to raised loaves, wrote with curiosity of this strange flat bread and the deft way the cook slapped it into shape. They cost almost nothing and cooked in seconds, always fresh because they could not be made ahead. Warm tortillas straight off the griddle were a small daily pleasure on the hard Southwestern run. Number 5. Tamales were the great treat of the southern stations, bundles of seasoned meat wrapped in masa and steamed inside corn husks. Making them took hours of work, so their appearance felt like a small occasion, a dish born of real care rather than mere necessity. The traveler peeled back the husk to find soft cornmeal wrapped around spiced meat, fragrant with chile and steam. Passengers on the Butterfield route and its southern rivals wrote with delight of tamales served at a remote outpost, a taste of genuine cooking amid the grease and hardtack of the trail. On the long, dusty runs through the borderlands, a plate of hot tamales was the highlight of the journey, proof that even at the edge of nowhere, a cook could set down something made with pride. Number 4. Sourdough biscuits rose golden in station ovens across the West, the frontier's answer to bread where fresh yeast could not be kept. The cook guarded a crock of sourdough starter like treasure, feeding it flour and water to keep it alive through the cold. For from it came light, tangy biscuits that turned a plain meal into a fine one. Split hot and smeared with grease, molasses, or gravy, they vanished the moment they hit the table. Travelers wrote of the joy of real risen bread after weeks of hardtack and corn dodgers. On the whole, long overland journey, few things pleased a weary passenger more than a basket of hot sourdough biscuits, and a station known for them earned a fond mention in many a journal. Number 3. Boiled coffee was the heart of every station meal, thick, black, and strong enough that travelers joked it could float a horseshoe. Brands like Arbuckle's, sold pre-roasted and ground, spread across the West and became the frontier standard, boiled hard in a battered pot until it turned nearly to tar. Cooks tossed the ground straight into the water and let it churn, sometimes settling it with a crushed eggshell. Travelers drank it scalding and bitter, grateful for anything hot on a freezing dawn, though many complained it was little more than muddy water on the poorer lines. Rough as it was, that black bitter brew was the fuel of the overland trail, the one comfort a traveler could count on at every stop. Number 2, fried beefsteak was the meal travelers dreamed of, and the one that most often disappointed them. Where fresh beef could be had, the station cook fried it, but pressed for time and short on tenderness, the steaks came off the skillet tough as saddle leather, cooked gray and hard in a puddle of grease. Passengers wrote scathing accounts of chewing endlessly on beef that fought back, longing for the tender cuts of home. Yet it was still fresh meat in a land of salt pork, and for that alone, it was prized. A plate cost as much as $1 at the better home stations. Tough or not, fried beefsteak was the aspiration of frontier dining. The meal that meant a station was doing its best by the road-worn souls it fed. Number 1, bacon and beans, crowned the frontier table as the undisputed king of stagecoach meals, the dish that fueled the entire overland journey from the Missouri to the Pacific. Beans simmered for hours with salt pork or bacon until soft and rich, the fat melting into the pot and giving the whole thing a smoky, savory depth. Cheap, filling, and endlessly reliable, it appeared at more station meals than any other dish, ladled hot beside biscuits and coffee. A bowl cost only pennies, and it kept a traveler going through hours of jolting road. Every diary of the Overland Trail mentions it, sometimes with weariness at its sameness, sometimes with real gratitude for its warmth. The smell of bacon and beans bubbling on the stove meant supper was near and the day's danger was behind. It was the true taste of the frontier, the meal that carried travelers across outlaw country and delivered them, fed and standing, to the far side of the West. From the humble fried mush that opened our list to the mighty bacon and beans at the top, these 30 stagecoach meals tell the story of how America ate its way across a wild and dangerous frontier. They were rough, greasy, and often barely enough, yet they carried travelers through deserts, mountains, and outlaw-haunted passes to the far edge of the country. Which of these frontier dishes would you have braved before crossing outlaw country? Tell us in the comments, and safe travels down the trail.